human rights and the environment. So whenever you want, Benedita, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Laura. So first of all, I would like to thank our dear guest speakers who volunteered to be here today to talk with us about fair trade and sustainability. Fair trade is a trading partnership that is based on dialogue, transparency, and respect, and that seeks greater equity in international trade. Fair trade is a social movement particularly focused on producers, which aims to improve their standing in order to make trade more fair. And this movement has resulted in the adoption of a series of labels and internationally agreed standards on fair pricing and contracting conditions. Today, we will focus on the impact of fair trade on the protection of human rights throughout the value chain, and especially on fair labor conditions. And we have with us Elena Lunder, Leonard Feld, and Margarida Marques. Elena Lunder is a policy and project advisor at the Fair Trade Advocacy Office, where she works as the lead on the work on human rights and environmental due diligence, on focusing knowledge co-creation and advocacy work to ensure the upcoming framework on mandatory human rights due diligence, and ensuring that it leads to positive impacts for workers, smallholder farmers, and artisans in global value chains. Combining her background in European studies and human rights law, she has started working at EU policy level with the Fair Trade Advocacy Office in 2019. Leonard Feld is a legal scholar with a focus on business and human rights and sustainable finance. From May 2022, he will work as a postdoctoral researcher at the Center for Law, Sustainability and Justice at the University of Southern Denmark. Leonard holds both a PhD and an LLM from the European University Institute, as well as a German law degree from the University of Bonn. Alongside his research, he lectures on questions of sustainability in academic and professional settings. Last but definitely not least, Margarida Marques is a member of the European Parliament. She is vice chair of the Committee on Budgets and member of the Committee on International Trade and of the Committee on Economic and Monetary Affairs. She is also a member of the delegation to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Union for the Mediterranean, of the Delegation for Relations with the People's Republic of China, and of the Delegation for Relations with Maghreb countries and the Arab Maghreb Union. She was a member of the Portuguese Parliament and a State Secretary for EU Affairs. And previously, she was a European Commission official from 1991 until 2015, and was head of the European Commission representation in Portugal between 2005 and 2011. She holds a degree in mathematics, statistics, and a master's degree in education science. Thank you all very much for being here today. So my first question is addressed to Elena Lunder. So fair trade as a social movement is a trading partnership that seeks greater equity in international trade. How is equity defined, or how would you say it is defined by the fair trade movement?
Thank you, and thank you for having me today to speak about this. I think, as you recognize, it can be really important within the conversation on business and human rights. And I think the way the fair trade movement is approaching the concept of equity and really what is the basis of the movement itself can be really a useful area to explore. And it is based on the idea that that trading relationships, that global trading, need to work towards the rights of producers and workers in marginalized positions, that it is a trading partnership and not a relationship that enables exploitative conditions. So really at the core of this movement is the idea, that the global trade should be based on partnership and not exploitation. And this came out of the observation, which we can see in many sectors, but especially the ones that the fair trade movement knows best, and also that I'm familiar with most, the agri-food supply chains and textiles, for example. It is very evident that power relations in global value chains are massively asymmetrical. So with a larger base of, for example, smallholder farmers producing, for example, 90% of world's cocoa, to a small number of traders, small number of brands, and again, a large number of producers, which creates this power imbalance where traders and buyers have a completely, a complete power to impose specific trading conditions upon for example, smallholder farmers that they are dealing with. So this can lead, and this has led to basically the general trade in agri-food being based on unfair trading practices, where buyers are now able to impose specific prices that are below the cost of production, contract conditions that put suppliers in disadvantaged positions, and lead times that put undue pressure on suppliers, and in that way also endangers or forces them to produce in ways that might not comply with human rights or environmental standards. So the movement's, I think, most important approach here is that we need to focus on this relationship. So we need to focus on purchasing practices. We need to focus on making these relationships more equal, on empowering workers, and especially when we work a lot, I mean, not we, the movement works a lot with producers who also hold decision-making power within the General Assembly, for example, of some of the labels. And so basically, it boils down to creating more equal power relationships. And finally, the most important and difficult point to address here are prices, which I mentioned. They are currently being forced down to prices that go below the cost of production. And a study from ILO from 2017, for example, to go outside of the movement for proof, found that 40% in general across sectors of producers that were interviewed for this study, sell their goods below costs of production. So, and this was just across sectors. In some sectors it's higher, in some sectors it's lower, but it really shows how it is impossible that we strive for better conditions for any kind of, for smallholder farmers, for workers, in terms of human rights or environmental standards, if they are still forced to produce on costs below, on such low prices. It is really the basis of developing better standards in global supply chains, to also look at this race to the bottom in prices.
Thank you very much, Elena. Following up on your thoughts on this attempt to make trade more fair by balancing the conditions of the market, I would ask Leonard Feld, how can we ensure that fair trade companies respect human rights throughout the value chain? And if you think that international certification schemes, such as fair trade standards for hired labor, are sufficient to countervent this problem?
Thank you, Benedita, for the question, and thank you for having me. Yes, so fair trade companies or companies participating in the fair trade system are different actors. They're of course the original producers, but there are also traders and finally also retailers. So there are very different forms of companies involved. And one could argue that these companies are probably dedicated to address their negative impacts, particularly on human rights along the supply chain, simply because they take part in the fair trade system. However, it should be emphasized that the participation in fair trade is not necessarily the same as respecting human rights. So I would argue that many of the tools that fair trade provides are very useful for companies when they wish to comply with their expectations to respect human rights. But it's definitely not all they have to do. And I think fair trade holds the same view that there's more to respecting human rights than only to engaging in fair trade. Not at least because human rights challenges are very diverse. And as Elena mentioned, fair trade has particular expertise in very specific sectors, like the agro-food sector or in specific textile products. And this is where their strength lies. But the possible forms of human rights abuse is much more diverse in practice. And I think if we look on how fair trade is addressing human rights, that a specific focus on labor rights. So also here we can have to take into consideration that there are also other human rights in specific contexts that specific companies face that have to take also into consideration. And this also applies to differences in business lines and the different actors and along the supply chain. Not only the original producers, but human rights impacts may also occur further up or down the supply chain, actually. So if we now come to your question on how to ensure that fair trade companies in particular respect human rights throughout the value chain, I would say, notwithstanding their dedication and participation in the system, I would say principally the same applies as to all companies. So companies have to commit to human rights. They need a human rights policy statement and commitment. They should apply national standards and engage in comprehensive human rights due diligence. And they should also engage in appropriate remediation where they actually contribute or are causing a human rights impact. And to facilitate that in general, I think we need what the UN guiding principles are advocating for, a smart mix of measures. So we need awareness raising, something that fair trade is doing. We need consumer activism, and something also fair trade is facilitating by providing consumers with a label that is representing a specific standard and gives more information on what a certain product, in the circumstances, a certain product was basically produced, sourced, developed. We also need multi-stakeholder initiatives. I think also fair trade is a good example for, and I personally believe that we also need the engagement of shareholders and institutional investors that basically provide some pressure and some demand from the investee companies to basically engage in relevant processes throughout the supply chain. And lastly, I see great potential in the in legislation. And I think on the EU level, we have some interesting developments with the proposal for corporate sustainability due diligence directive, and also additional transparency laws that will require companies to better to disclose what they're doing in terms of diligence, which would also impact the way they would address negative impacts along their supply chains.
Thank you very much, Leonard. I agree with you. I think that this movement has brought to our attention a series of problems of the global economy, and its advocacy work is very important nowadays, even if other initiatives may be necessary to tackle these problems. And I would now ask Margarida Marques if she thinks that this social movement is a possible answer, or if it lacks the necessary enforceability to actually foster change.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Yes, thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you also to give me the opportunity to be with you and heard from scientists, someone who made research and academic knowledge on these issues. It's very important because it's not my profile. When I was in the government as State Secretary for European Affairs, I was in charge of trade also, and now I'm in the Trade Committee. So I have more the political approach than the academic approach. But I'd like to start to give to you two examples, two studies that were published recently and where I think that we have very interesting contributions. Maybe you know them better than me, but we organized at the end of February, we organized two different presentations in the committee. One is a comparative analysis of trade and sustainable development, TSD, provisions in free trade agreements, is a study developed by LSE, and as I said, it was presented in the committee end of February. It's a very comprehensive study, and in my point of view, very interesting. And the second document is also a study developed in the Parliament by the General Direction for External Policies on the Policy Department, and is External Policy Tools to Address Modern Slavery and Forced Labor. So one and the other, I don't know if you know them or not, but they are both very interesting. So I'd like to start a bit on how policy can be important for the promotion of human rights, of common standards on social rights, on environmental rights, on, for example, food security and other areas. First of all, more and more when we spoke on trade agreements, we start to use the way FTA, so fair trade agreements. On the end of the day, there are no trade agreements if they are not fair. FTA must have a role on the regulation of globalization. It is the only tool we have to regulate globalization. You can react and say to me, no, it's not the only tool, and I need to agree with you. But of course, it's a strong tool, and it's a stronger tool nowadays with the situation in WTO. And it's why the FTAs are so important to regulate globalization, to have a more social and green world, and to avoid wild globalization. And this debate, trade needs to take place in a context that benefits both people and environment. And our primary goal is therefore to make sure that countries abide by international social and environmental standards. And these principles must be a conditionality to accede to internal market. And it's why the new European initiative on TSD chapters linked with the revision of the TSD mechanism, and our position as political group is very clear concerning how important TSD chapters are in the FTAs. And we have here a clear position. First of all, TSD chapters should contain a sanction-based enforcement mechanism. This enforcement mechanism should build upon the existing procedure with the panel of experts, which should be made quicker and more efficient. TSD chapters should be reinforced by adding clear and detailed country-specific roadmaps for implementation. Ratification and implementation of the core ILO conventions and Paris Agreement should be an absolute minimum requirement for all trade agreements. But we need that this is not enough. It means it's not enough to ratify the ILO convention. For example, to ratify the ILO convention on forced labor. We need to have mechanisms to be sure that member states that had ratified ILO conventions, they will use and they will respect ILO convention. Furthermore, the language on ratification and the implementation of the FTAs should be reinforced. A greater convergence is needed between our autonomous measures and the TSD chapters in trade agreements. And the process of improving trade and sustainability commitment should be a broad and continual commitment and not end after the presentation of the TSD review. So here we can, and I don't use more time on this point, here we can speak on the role of the multilateral organizations, ILO and WTO. And before and the answer to your question, I'd like also to say that with CETA, with the agreement with Canada, we are in a new generation of trade agreements with two innovations. First one, standards on social, environment, and food security. Second, the mechanism to solve disputes, the dispute settlement. Unfortunately, we couldn't be stronger on this mechanism in the framework of WTO, but we are working on it.
Thank you very much, Margarida, Marques, for your more policy-focused view on these issues. Also refreshing for panels that usually are more academic. I will now ask Elena Lunder another question. What are the main principles of fair trade and the fair trade movement, and what do they advocate for a change in the global economy and how it works?
Thank you. Yeah, I would actually before diving into this, I would just like to emphasize again. I think this is generally clear, but just to be sure that when we talk about the fair trade movement, we talk about a really broad and different, diverse group of organizations. So I think most of the time when we say fair trade, we think of the label that is the green and blue men on chocolate and coffee, and this is a big part of it. But there's also another label, World Fair Trade Organization, and there are also numerous other social enterprises working towards more sustainable business models and on policy changes and on other campaigning measures and so on. So it's quite a diverse setup, and it's hard to speak about it as one. But when it comes to principles, yes, that is something that is possible to do. And the principles I already touched upon in my first answer, which for sure the first and most important one is trade as partnership and not predatory exploitation. And then this then follows, is followed up by more detailed approaches, such as also, yes, the approach to specific formulation of trade partnerships through rules on fair trade practices, on specific terms and conditions in contracts that enable a more partnership-based relationship between suppliers and buyers, fairer prices. There is, again, this is difficult to say because different schemes have a different approach to fairer prices, but specifically looking at the fair trade label, there is a minimum price that always remains either at the lowest market price, if at the lowest subsistence price, if the market price drops lower, and if the market price comes up, it rises a little bit as well. It also has a premium on top that is up to the producer cooperatives to use as it's seen fit in the local context. So it's the decision there. But this is just an example, but one of the main principles are fairer prices. This, of course, is an uphill I don't want to say battle, but journey that's still well, everybody's working towards improving this continuously. We can't say really that we are there in general, but it's one of the most important goals and emphasis of work. There is also a very strong emphasis on well, partnership also in decision making. As I said, this is also the basis of the structure of all of the organizations, really, and that is visible in the structures of the general assemblies, of boards of directors, and so on, which again differ per organization, but this is a common standard. There's also percentually more women present in these decision-making roles than in other organizations. Again, this is also an uphill journey that we're continually improving, but also one of the most important points. And another element of this partnership approach is also long-term trading relationships. So in addition to having specific terms and conditions in contracts and specific approach to prices and collaboration, there's also an emphasis on maintaining these relationships long-term, because this gives security to all parties involved, especially then also to, for example, I keep coming back to smallholder farmers because this is my area in the advocacy work that I do with the Fair Trade Advocacy Office. Then these smaller organizations that generally do not have such a, financial backup or something like that, they have security to invest in more sustainable methods. They have security in receiving income in the next few years. It's one of the most important points that we talk about here. I think this would be, but of course, as was pointed out by Leonard, this is a specific approach. It's an ongoing work, and it's impossible to say, that any kind of adverse impact or a violation does not exist in this kind of organization. And also often when we talk about fair trade organizations, these are the social economy enterprises or the World Fair Trade Organizations, but the FI label, that is just a licensee. So really KitKat can have this label, but it's not a fair trade organization. So it's an important distinction, I think, to see here, because their rest of their operations can be whatever, really. But I think this covers it.
Thank you very much, Elena. Shifting a bit to another topic, fair trade, as well as other soft law approaches to regulating companies' conduct throughout the value chain, as to what concerns human rights or labor rights or environmental protection, have consistently failed in establishing responsible business conduct. And I would like to ask Leonard if you think a hard law approach is the only possible solution for this problem.
Thank you, Benedita. So I would first say that soft law approaches have not all failed. The guiding principles as a main framework on business and human rights was adopted in 2011, and 10 years later, I think we are definitely a few steps ahead. We now have some international framework that are generally accepted as a new standard. We have dedicated companies that at least strive to respect human rights in accordance with these standards. And we have numerous international actors ranging from the OECD to the EU, but also organizations like FIFA who have taken up these standards of business and human rights. And I think this is all something that is also worth acknowledging. And notwithstanding this progress and these developments, it's also fair to say that still the way companies address human rights issues in practice is still largely insufficient. So we have still only a minority of companies that really engages in comprehensive due diligence and really comprehensive checks to what extent their own business approach, their own business relationships may have negative impacts. And there are studies, for example, the corporate human rights benchmarks in 2020 that show that not only there are not enough companies complying with these international standards, but there are also some misconceptions. So some companies wish to maybe implement these tools and practices, but they clearly don't understand how they work. For example, they mix up risks to human rights with risks to the companies, right, which are not necessarily overlapping. Or they might prioritize specific human rights impacts, not on a risk-based approach, prioritizing what is most severe in practice, but more, for example, what is more easy to address, what might look better with their investors, and so forth. And against this background, I see there is definitely value and there is need for additional legislation, so what you call a hard law approach. And I think the EU is currently preparing relevant steps, and I'm very curious to see what comes out of it. So I'm rather optimistic that there are further developments coming that might actually change the way or might increase compliance of companies and hopefully also the quality of human rights and environmental due diligence processes in practice. However, I still believe that the smart mix of measures is the policy strategy that should be favored, not at least because the adoption of a law is still not the implementation of a law in practice. So between adoption and sufficient implementation, there is a gap which has to be filled through a lot of time-consuming tasks of sufficient enforcement, sufficient monitoring, the capacity of companies to actually understand what their responsibilities are, as well as a really careful consideration of the potential negative effects, what the potential consequences of these laws in particular in the global south. So I believe we here have to stay watchful and basically follow up and support these new developments for a hard law approach. But I believe it's only one brick in the wall. It's an important one, but I still believe the smart mix is the way forward.
Thank you very much, Leonard. There is indeed an upcoming directive on mandatory due diligence for human rights and environmental concerns that is expected to be adopted at the European level. And this directive would cover European companies and companies operating in the European market, and is considered essential to ensure that the EU contributes to a form of economic globalization that provides for human development. And I would like to ask Margarida, Marques, if you think that fair trade contributed for us to get to this point.
First of all, I like to agree with Leonard when he said first the law, but the law sometimes can't change the practices, and we need to implement the law, and the implementation of the law is essential. But concerning this directive, it's clear that with this proposal, there are two main goals. First, to address consumers' concerns who do not want to buy products that are made with the involvement of forced labor or that destroy the environment, for instance. Second, to support business by providing legal certainty about their obligations in the single market. And this law will project European values on the value chains and will do so in a fair and proportionate way. It's our point of view. While some European companies are already leaders in sustainable corporate practices, many still face challenges in understanding and improving their environmental footprints and human rights track record. It's why the Commission proposed this corporate due diligence duty, and according to these proposals, companies need to, and I quote, integrate due diligence into policies, identify actual or potential adverse human rights and environment impacts, prevent or mitigate potential impacts, bring to an end or minimize actual impacts, establish and maintain a complaints procedure, monitor the effectiveness of the due diligence policy and measures, and publicly communicate on due diligence. But internal market is based, of course, on European production, goods and services, but also on imports. And it's why it is in this framework that we need to consider the CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. And this new mechanism, CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, is something that the Commission proposed to create to avoid environmental dumping. Why? Because Commission, European Union is demanding to European industry, to European companies, to European investors to do the energy transition, to be more green, to replace equipment, to have new source of energy, and these demand money, these demand investment. And products are put in the European market. But we know that we import products coming from third countries, the same products, but not respecting these goals, the environmental goals. It's why the Commission, we are discussing and we are trying to have a final decision still during the French presidency, it means during this semester, because the idea is to have this carbon border adjustment mechanism for products imported by third countries that are not respecting exactly the same environment criteria. So it's why, and I think that Leonard gave to us a very interesting context on how the enterprises, how the companies are working, but we need, as we demand, a level playing field for internal market. We need to maintain this ambition of a level playing field with the products that arrived to Europe coming from third countries where environmental standards and these efforts for the green transition are not respected.
Thank you very much, Margarida. So the last question that I would like to pose to all of you is what lessons can fair trade teach us when it comes to protecting human rights throughout the value chain?
Should I start?
Of course.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so I will focus in this case on this legislative proposal by the European Commission, because yeah, so that we can get as concrete as possible. And I will also focus on a few of the lessons learned that we see as the most important in this conversation. And these are four, and I will add a fifth one since we're talking about labels today a little bit as well. So first, I think the most important lesson learned here again is that we need to talk about partnerships, even when we talk about the sustainable corporate due diligence and the obligation of companies that will be either based in the EU web covered by the scope of the directive to conduct due diligence. We need to talk about the equal share of responsibility that needs to be carried by each of the actors. So these companies should definitely be obliged to take on the responsibility that they have for whatever adverse impacts that they cause or contribute to throughout the entire supply chain. And it should not be facilitated that they easily hand it off through codes of conduct and for example, contract clauses, which we can see right now in the legislative proposal. We see as a really important element to address this, to also include an obligation to address own purchasing practices. This is something already present in the recitals, but it should also be present as part of the obligation, as for example, also in the own initiative report by the European Parliament that was published last year. So companies should be obliged to look at their own practices and how they can influence, either prevent or enable their suppliers and the suppliers of the suppliers to produce sustainably. And when talking about this, I come to the second point, where it is already really nice to see that the annex that lists specific rights and prohibitions and instruments. Nothing to say about this division and the format of the annex, but it's very nice to see that living wage, the prohibition of withholding living wage is a part of that, because living wage and living income are both human rights and preconditions for the fulfillment of numerous other human rights, adequate housing, adequate food. Well, we can continue, but they are different. So living wages are a product of an employment relationship. And when we're talking about smallholder farmers, who make up a huge chunk of the global agricultural supply chains, they earn living incomes. They are self-employed. So if you want to cover that as well, this needs to be specifically mentioned in the text as well. Of course, the third point is emphasis on stakeholder engagement, meaningful stakeholder engagement, which includes also smallholder farmers that sometimes might get lost because of their place far at the start of the supply chain, several tiers away from a company that might be obliged, and because of their status as also an economic operator, but they really need to be considered as rights holders as well. And of course, stakeholder consultation is essential for any positive, effective action in addressing human rights in global supply chains, because this is the only way to really inform what is needed and how this should be done. And finally, I would like to say, so the point we emphasize, as I said before, are long-term sourcing relationships. And in the specific case of the directive, this would mean a very rigorous approach to disengagement. So disengagement should really just be supported as a last resort measure. This is clear from the United Nations Guiding Principles and the OECD guidelines. It's just not reflected in the proposal as well as it should be. it really should be a last resort measure preceded by cooperation, good faith cooperation. And then I would also like to say, just because we are talking about the fair trade movement here, that when it comes to third-party verification schemes, because they do have a role in the legislative proposal, what we have learned, as it was mentioned today, is that voluntary schemes can offer insight. They can be useful tools, but they can't replace the responsibility of a company. So they should be seen as possibly a tool that helps to implement specific elements, but there should be rigorous standards on what third-party verification schemes can qualify as such. And they should also carry their own share of responsibility if they agree to such a role in the process of a company. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes, if I may continue, I think Elena mentioned quite some points that I can only agree with. So from business human rights perspective, I think the experience of fair trade can teach us something about transparency and how the value of transparency, both from an economic perspective for companies sourcing, as well as from sustainability perspective, because many global supply chains remain non-transparent. So particularly the case in the electronic and industry in case of minerals and metals. And I think here the example of fair trade shows that if a specific product is traceable, or at least to some extent the supply chain is more transparent, it puts companies in a much better position to even see what problems there are and then to actively engage with the stakeholders or their sub-suppliers and suppliers directly. And I think this is a major advantage that one can learn from, which is then also necessarily important in the discussion about supply due diligence laws, where it is absolutely important to require due diligence that covers the entire supply chains. Although the proposal so far focuses in particular on established relationships. But this is maybe also something that is something that can be learned, because fair trade also, as Elena already emphasized, is putting a great emphasis on continuous and long-term business relationships. And I think you also just mentioned that, which of course allows companies further downstream the supply chain to build capacity to basically work in partnership with the goal to address certain human rights challenges in a specific sector. And I think this is something that is also something that can be learned, because a more dedicated long-term business relationship allows to address problems probably more sustainable than just to switch suppliers every other month, which then does not allow to really build a partnership and to address certain issues in the long term. I think what has also already been mentioned by Elena, but I just want to emphasize it once more, is certification is important and it's definitely one source of information, but it also has been shown by scientists and NGOs that certification also has its flaws, and it's therefore very important to not rely only on audits, social audits and the like, but also to engage additionally with other stakeholders, whether it's civil society organizations, human rights defenders, or the affected right holders directly. And I think this is something that should be emphasized and that also should probably be better represented in the hopefully upcoming EU directive. And finally, I think fair trade is a good example showing that specific demands as regards human rights or the environment should not only be pushed down the supply chain, so that specific companies just demand standards from their suppliers and thereby push the responsibility down the chain, but it's rather a matter of partnership and a matter of companies working together along the chain to adhere to specific standards, and also sharing to some extent the costs of bringing the supply chain to a specific standard. This would be the lessons I would personally draw from the fair trade movement. Although maybe one last aspect, maybe something that hasn't been mentioned, that of course fair trade is a consumer-driven tool, meaning that the impact of fair trade still relies on consumer demand, meaning that here we have some limitation, which also should be probably mentioned, because yeah, the way fair trade can make it have an impact, or a positive impact on especially small farmers and producers, is that this is actually demanded by consumers, which presupposes that consumers are willing and willing to pay maybe a bit more for specific products that have a specific label. So this is of course a limitation, but I looked up some data on the share of, or basically the total revenues of fair trade products in the past years, and one can see that really has increased a lot in the past 2 decades. So I think there is some reason for optimism that this might actually continue, and thereby give fair trade a larger share and maybe a larger voice in international trade in general.
Thank you very much, Leonard.
Okay, now I think that Elena and Leonard already answered to your question, and I fully agree with what they said. I only like to say that for us in the intercommittee, it's very important to work with NGOs, with FTAO, for example. We created a fair trade working group, and we are working together on the points that you raised, for example. And for example, we propose amendments to the legislative initiatives of the Commission, amendments that we discussed before, we discussed previously in this fair trade working group. And this was very useful for us. It's not only a political approach or an in-house approach, but we try to integrate other views and other experience. And we felt that the amendments that we put on the table are more can answer better to consumers, to citizens, to companies, and also to find a way to have more responsibility, to respect social and environmental standards. And also, we published op-ed, an article together, signed by MEPs and members of the Fair Trade Working Group in Euroactiv, that it was also a very interesting experience. So only to share with you that we try always heard from civil society, from NGOs, from fair trade organizations, trying to give a complete approach, a wide approach of these on these discussions. And finally, and when I was hearing Elena, last week I was in a mission in India. Because as we are aware, I imagine European Union and India are trying to relaunch negotiations for a trade FTA, investment agreement, and geographic indications agreement. That it was agreed in Porto last year during the Portuguese presidency, and we relaunched the negotiations. We need to say that the negotiations were blocked 2013. So, and now we relaunched the negotiation, and it's why one mission from Intercommittee went to India last week. And it was a very, very interesting experience because we can see how the debate that we had here today is important. It means how far from is the acceptation of the ILO conventions, of Paris agreements, of other compromises, and the reality that we can check on the land, and the reality that we know that we are living in some countries. It's why I started the discussion, and I know that there are some member states, like France, for example, that are not very are not very like-minded on trade agreements. But it's why we consider that trade agreements can have an important role on the regulation of the globalization, on social rights, on environmental rights, on the respect of fighting forced labor, for example, child labor. So it's something that we can use trade agreements to improve this situation. But of course, it's not enough to have these conditions. We need also to have the capacity to have the capacity that all the compromises are respected. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a couple of questions from the audience, and I would just like to encourage everyone that is watching, if they have any questions, they can send them in the chat or ask them directly. Dusu asked, at the European level, as it was mentioned, there has been a legislative push for mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence. From a policy-making perspective, should fair trade be integrated completely in the human rights due diligence discourse and legislative proposals, or doing that would take the focus away from the fair trade movement itself? You can go ahead, Elena.
Thanks. So it's an interesting thought. We were never this ambitious, really, to just completely mainstream fair trade into the due diligence proposal. But I think it's already, but the way we imagined it, it's already really strong to just look at it from the fair trade perspective and from the principles that fair trade movement is based on, and follow those, like the comment I made to the last question. So yeah, no, I think it's really important also not to approach this in a silo approach, but to look at all possible tools, like it was mentioned also by Leonard before, to look at this from different perspectives and really more holistically. And so also as trade and sustainable development chapters are a really important puzzle piece in there. Fair trade principles can also be reflected in there. Due diligence standards can also be reinforced by those chapters. So really it's such an interrelated network. But I think that, yes, these lessons learned that we talked about today can actually need to inform these policies and other measures, because we see them really as integral in effective, in effecting transformation.
Thank you, Elena.
I can also answer to your question, the question from Dusu Jabula. I don't know if it's the good pronunciation, I imagine it's not. But my point is that the fair trade movement must be strong and must have the capacity to demand the respect of, because we can, and I'm sure that, and we are working on that perspective, to have a strong and to integrate human rights in due diligence on the legislative proposal, and to be very, very strong on it. But of course, it's not enough. First of all, we need to adopt it in the Parliament and in the Council. Maybe it's not so much difficult to adopt and to find a common position in the European Parliament. The point is the implementation. And for the implementation, the fair trade movement is very, very important. So for the first question. For the second question, can strategic litigation help push the fair trade movement forward? I wish yes. I wish that the answer is yes. It's the better way to answer to this question. First of all, we need the modernization of WTO must integrate a dispute settlement, a permanent mechanism for the dispute settlement, but of course, one time more, the fair trade movement can have a role, for example, introducing some cases in this dispute settlement, and finally avoid that the capacity to introduce files in the dispute settlement must be open and not for institutions or for companies. It must be open, giving capacity for the trade movement to put some files in this, to introduce some files in this dispute settlement.
Thank you. Leonard, would you like to also answer this question?
Yes, so as to the first question, I think, as Elena already rightly put it, it's not about integrating the fair trade movement in the proposal, but rather, using the fair trade movement on the stage of implementation. And as the idea of human rights vigilance is, as we also discussed, broader than the idea of fair trade, I think the broader one should then maybe make use of the more specific fair trade tools to make sure that the future directive is sufficiently implemented, which will probably certainly be a very huge challenge in practice. And I think here fair trade has most expertise and experience, and can play a vital role in helping companies to comply with their future obligations. And as regards the second question, if I may, this is actually something I just came to my mind. So I think if we talk about strategic litigation, we can think of different forms where this can be pushed forward. I think Margarida talked about more the international economic perspective, trade law, WTO mechanisms. But I think there's also potential for civil litigation, for example, that consumers or consumer organizations could basically bring a lawsuit forward where companies may label products as fair trade where this is actually not the case. So wherever there's proof of false labeling, so to say, and I think there has been a case like that. I'm sorry, I cannot remember the specifics now, that this may actually be a tool to enforce the fair trade standards from a more consumer perspective. And a similar approach would be that competitors, so other companies, could basically bring a claim for unfair competition against their competitors if these competitors use the fair trade label, although in reality the products might actually not meet the fair trade standards. So here I see some potential for strategic litigation where the labels such as fair trade are falsely used. But of course, this presupposes that consumers or consumer organizations or competitors have the necessary information, which then again probably requires specific investigations and probably the work of civil society and human rights defenders to bring such information to public and then allow such strategic litigation to happen.
I forgot to answer the second question. May I go now?
Of course.
So I think, yeah, all the points until now were important, but then also coming from a third perspective, in not companies or civil litigation. Here, there was also a case in the Netherlands in public procurement. I can't remember the date now, but it was before the new version, before 2014 of public procurement directives. And on the basis of this case, the revision of the directives allowed public procurers to list fair trade as or comparable products in the criteria for public procurement. So it also helped at policy level change to have such cases. And on the other hand, when it comes to implementation, which I agree will be actually also a big challenge, even if we are satisfied with the text of the directive, litigation at that stage would also help in enforce what standard is expected of companies when applying the directive. So if, for example, purchasing practices become a subject of such litigation and their impacts, pricing mechanisms, or well, even obstructing the ability to earn living income, something like that, this would greatly strengthen kind of niche causes that would so get more attention.
Thank you very much, Elena. It just occurred to me that maybe the new upcoming EU directive and maybe also other hard law initiatives that have been brought up in Europe on mandatory human rights due diligence, specifically the ones that have civil liability schemes associated with them, can also foster corporate responsibility as to what concerns fair trade licensing. So in case a company uses fair trade certification and does not comply with its standards, if the company is also violating human rights or environmental principles or environmental law, could a lawsuit be brought against this company on that basis?
I think I don't know if that would go under the due diligence proposal. I think this would just give cause to the certifier to remove the certification. But I am, yeah, I've never looked at this before. There is an upcoming legislation also at EU level that will look at green claims and will provide some standards on what labels can say, because it's trying to address exactly that. This, well, not exactly that, but a mix of problems when it comes to labels. One is using a label when one is not complying with it, and the other one is just this sea of sustainability labels that consumers no longer know if they can rely on or not. So maybe in combination with that, it's yeah, it might be a different field out there in a few years, legally speaking, in such a particular case. So I'm not sure. But in any case, I think, I hope really that the directive would not allow at the end, the current formulation we see as not allowing that, would not allow a company to claim that they comply with due diligence if they have a sustainability label. This should not be possible for them if they comply with the label or not.
Yeah, I would agree that it's probably important to separate the role of labels as consumer targeting tools, and the role of due diligence as a management process, right? So of course there are overlaps, and one can imagine maybe a label that guarantees specific management standards, but I think these are principally things that has to be differentiated. And yeah, as we got the quality of labels, I mean, the EU is now developing a taxonomy that is more focusing on investment products. So it's basically the idea that the Commission defines what is sustainable from an environmental perspective and potentially also from a social perspective. And the idea is that by defining this to prevent greenwashing, so in particular in the financial sector, to prevent specific banks or investment funds to promote a specific product, let's say a specific fund, to be green, even though in reality it then invests in technologies or companies that are not so green from a policy perspective. And here we see how a legislator actually steps in to define what is sustainable and also what is to some extent socially and environmentally sustainable. And this is of course from a different background. This is more financial legislation, but I think there's potential also to maybe use the taxonomy to some extent for a label initiative. I'm not an expert in this field, but I think there might be some potential developments happening once the taxonomy is established in the financial context.
Yes, I think that we have two different instruments now, legal instruments that can help on this goal. The first one is the revision of the TSD, the Trade and Sustainable Development. So this is, we are waiting for the proposal of the Commission, and I think that we can go deeper on this point. The second is taxonomy, as Leonard said. This is a huge debate now because we had the taxonomy, and where was clear the green investment, the concept of sustainable investment, in our view, is the only EU document that gives the concept of sustainable investment. But now the Commission put on the table a revision of the taxonomy, trying to include, to consider nuclear and gas as green. So our position is clear. It means Commission can consider investment in gas, in nuclear, gas and nuclear can be the part of the mix, the energy mix of each member state, but it's not green investment. It's not sustainable investment. This is our position, but I need to say that the Parliament is divided, including within the different political families, including in my political family and in other political families. But of course, taxonomy have a key role on this concept, sustainable investment, on the green bonds, for example, on the capacity that we have to demand to ECB don't have non-green bonds, and to increase his bonds in green bonds, as we are demanding for the EIB, the investment European Investment Bank, EIB, trying to become the green bank. So this is some political goals that we have, where taxonomy is key, and the concept of sustainable investment is key. So I agree with Leonard. Taxonomy is an important legislative instrument, and also the revision of TSD, that it's also important, because first of all, we need to agree in the European Union on a new concept of TSDs. And after, we need to transfer to use this this consensus, this compromise. I prefer to use these words than unanimity. This common view on TSDs, and after to be stronger on the FTA negotiations.
Thank you very much to all of you. I don't think we have any more questions, so I would just like to ask if you have any final words you'd like to say today.
Should we go the same way again?
Yeah, of course.
As final words, thank you so much for having me here as part of this panel. I think it was really interesting to exchange with everyone and to also hear other two speakers, Margarida and Leonard, and their approach to this topic. And yeah, I hope we can exchange in the future. I think it can be quite fruitful to think from different policy perspectives. This is something that really is really interesting now at the end, also to think from different initiatives at EU level and how these could also fit into the conversation about mainstreaming fair trade. And also, yeah, just to keep in mind here that maybe to close my part with saying that if something stays with you from my inputs from this conversation, it really should be that here in global trade, when it comes to business responsibility, we're talking about partnerships, we're talking about fair distribution of value, and fair distribution of risk, fair distribution of cost, fair distribution of responsibility, generally just fair relationship between us based in the European Union and our partners globally, but also between economic operators within the European Union. We should not forget that. So really just to base our collaboration on respect and consider the difficulty of facing these challenges throughout the global supply chains, and see this more as a paper exercise, but really as concrete work together. Thank you.
Okay, I can only follow up on Elena by thanking you for the invitation, for the interesting discussion. I enjoyed the different perspectives. Elena providing more of a more practical NGO-based and policy perspective, and Margarida for really substantial input in terms of trade, which is, I think, a really important context, particularly when talking about fair trade as an NGO, working to change the power imbalances, as Elena has explained. I also like to thank the audience and the two persons, so basically Dusu Jabula and also Alice Maria, for their questions. I think it's always good to participate in this kind of event. It's a good opportunity. And I think all of us should keep our eyes open and keep researching and looking into the ongoing negotiations for Due Diligence Directive, and look into how fair trade as a company or as an NGO can basically participate and basically help in the stage of implementation. I think this is still a field where lots of research can be done, and I think all of us will have some work to do in that regard. Thank you, everyone.
I think that Elena made a good resume, and Leonard raised the ambition that we need to have on this topic. Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you very much to have this opportunity to discuss with you and heard from you some very interesting points. I only add a final point. It means we need to have more transparency and give a more important role to the fair trade movement during the negotiations of the trade agreements, of the fair trade agreements. This is important. Of course, the improvement that we could introduce in CETA was a result of the fair trade movement's demand. So I think that we need more transparency and more capacity from fair trade movement for citizens, consumers organizations, social rights organizations to have the capacity to give elements for the FTA negotiations. And for it, we need more transparency. Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much for your time and for your participation in this discussion. Your inputs were certainly very valuable to all of us watching today. So thank you again and have a nice rest of the week.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.